Ads schmads. If you don't want ads, that's okay. Choose the Dave McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts. And hey presto, no ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
What's the crack there? It's time for the podcast. The podcast today is going to be all about Syria, the geopolitical impact, the significance, the consequences, who's the winners, who's the losers, what's going to happen in that most fascinating and most pivotal of countries. But before we go to Syria, John, you and I were at the 3 Arena.
We certainly were. Saturday night, Fontaine's DC.
Pretty good gig.
A stonking gig.
It was
a stonking gig.
An unbelievably good gig. Unbelievably good gig.
They're a band on the rise and they're going to keep going.
But they're a band on the rise with a back catalogue of bangers already.
Yeah.
That's the extraordinary thing.
That's true. That's true.
You know? Anyway, it was an amazing gig. I'm not sure if they are going to be gigging again next year, but if they are, we would advise the listeners, the Dave McWilliams podcast, to definitely go to it because it's a pretty impressive, volatile cocktail of Dublin, of
energy,
punk, of energy,
pure energy,
all that sort of stuff.
The mosh pit was moshing.
The mosh pit was moshing. Of course, I was up.
I've never seen it like that.
By the
before.
way, you see, just so you know, right? The economist here was in the cheap seats. The sound engineer here, the man of the people over here, was like Little Caesar in his throne, right in the middle.
I had the best seats in the house.
I know,
smack in front of the stage,
and you got them free. Which is always,
I paid for them.
Which is always a sign of real wealth, John. Really rich people get free stuff.
That's true, but I paid for them.
Okay. Anyway, we are just going to genuflect to the Fontaines, and it was a really, really brilliant night. Just a quick word to our Patreons as we're coming to the end of the year. If you support us on Patreon, thank you very much. We couldn't do this without you. You have been there steadfast since the start, many. And if you would like to support the podcast next year, by all means, sign up on patreon.com/David McWilliams. And there are many, many chat rooms on the Patreon. What I love about Patreon is the fact that if we make a mistake on this podcast, which is rare, but sometimes straight on the Patrons, didn't happen in 1972, it happened in 1971. So, but
that's what we want, though. That's what we want.
So thank you for keeping us honest.
Yeah.
Patreons out there. Patreon.com/David McWilliams. An amazing Christmas present to the economics nerd in your life.
There you go, along with the book.
What else are we selling?
So let's get back to last weekend, Mac.
Yeah.
Now, I woke up in the morning and all of a sudden...
You usually wake up in the middle of the day. It's impressive.
That's true. But the whole world had changed. Yeah. Syria, we were hearing about, the trouble going on in Aleppo, and then all of a sudden... it exploded.
Yeah, like this time last week we mentioned it. Yeah. And we said, look, this is very interesting and I wonder what's going to happen here.
Yeah.
And within a week, a 50-year-old regime is gone, right? And the reason it's 50 is because Assad took over from his father.
Yeah.
Right? And his father took over in the early 70s. So let's look at this from altitude. Let's try and get above the frame and see what's going on. I want to start here in New York. I want to go to a place called Gaziantep in Turkey.
Okay.
And then I want to go to a place called Scottsdale, Arizona, and a place called Paradise Lane. I'm going to put this all
sounds
together.
dodgy.
It does, doesn't it? It was a Google Zeitgeist conference that I spoke at about 10 years ago.
That's even more dodgy.
That is even more dodgy, right? So you're absolutely right. But it's the end of the 50-year rule of Assad. It is, I think, the end of a 2.5-decade-long crusade orchestrated against socialist-leaning Arab countries. Now, when I say socialist-leaning, the very first time I ever met a Syrian person, ever, was in the In-Tourist Hotel in Moscow in 1986, right?
Right.
Now, the In-Tourist Hotel in Moscow, right? I went on a college trip to Moscow, right?
Yeah.
And there were only 3 or 4 places you could go to get, as Westerners, you could go and mix with Russians. And they tended to be in the big hotels. So the In-Tourist Hotel was this massive Soviet hotel. Subsequently, it has been knocked down.
Right, okay.
But we're at the bar, and there were the lads that were there, and they were chatting away in Arabic. And I I said, where are you guys from? And they said, we're from Damascus.
Mm.
The links between Syria and Russia were cultivated by Assad's father. And Assad's father was a member of what they call the Ba'ath Socialist Party.
Right.
So too was Saddam Hussein, and so too was Nasser in Egypt, the guy who nationalized the Suez Canal.
Right,
and
okay.
precipitated the Suez conflict in 1956, right? So these were all left-leaning, secular, really unpleasant geezers, right?
Right.
But secular leaders committed to an anti-religious future, that Islam wouldn't become...
To an anti-religious?
Yes, they were anti-religious because they believed that religion would bring the Arabs back to the 11th century. And they were trying to be... They were futurists. They were modernists. They were in the mode of Ataturk. And Ataturk, as you know, is one of my great heroes, right?
Yes, yeah,
I have always found him, Kemal Ataturk, to be one of the most fascinating leaders. And like same thing in Turkey. He said, we're going forward. He dropped, remember, the Turks dropped their own alphabet.
Yeah.
They dropped their alphabet. They weren't allowed to wear the fez anymore, which I know you'd find upsetting because you quite like a fez, John.
A la Tommy Cooper, yeah.
Anyway, the reason I start in New York is 9/11. 9/11 precipitated a crusade largely financed and orchestrated from Washington of what they call regime change.
Right.
Now, not for the first time.
No, sure. America, we're always about regime change. You know, even like we did a podcast quite a while ago about the regime change in Iran.
Oh, Mossadegh.
Mossadegh, which basically sparked off the whole anti-American thing in the Middle East.
That's absolutely true. What happened in Mossadegh, just so you know, Mossadegh wanted to kick out big American oil companies and British oil companies.
Right.
Now, BP, you know, the big British oil company, that means British Persian oil company,
yeah.
right? They had their mitts all over it. And Mossadegh said, no, after the Second World War, no, we're going to take the oil.
Yeah.
And the
rightly.
And the Yanks deposed him and put in the Shah. And then the Shah was deposed by a communist revolution, which was usurped by the religious people. So the original revolution against the Shah was left-wing students, right? Which is really fascinating.
In 79. Yeah.
But they were outmaneuvered by our friend Khomeini, who was in exile in France at the time. And he came back and he moved the Iranian revolution in this religious way, in this fundamentalist way. So we come back, right? After 9/11, even though there is no evidence of Saddam Hussein's involvement at all, the Americans decide to pin the blame on Saddam Hussein when they knew it was Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. When they knew he was there, right?
Yeah.
But they said, no, this is our opportunity, right?
And then it was the weapons of mass destruction and all that kind of stuff.
Sort of stuff. So what they did then is they go in the Iraq war, they depose Saddam, they leave a vacuum. Into the vacuum comes all sorts of creatures that you never expected, number one. They then finance and encourage and orchestrate this Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring, of course, kicks off in Tunisia as a spontaneous event, but then as it begins to develop its own momentum into Egypt, into Tunisia, and then, of course, into Libya, who the Americans didn't like Gaddafi, right?
Yeah.
And then they encouraged the Syrians to take up arms against Assad, right? But after Libya, after Gaddafi, you get this extraordinary void, again, of just warlords coming in, right? And those warlords are the people largely responsible for the human trafficking now out of Africa into Europe.
Yeah.
Libya used to be almost like a stopper at the top of Africa, and Gaddafi was in there.
Yeah.
Once he's gone, it's chaos all over the place, right? And of course, then the Americans encourage the Free Syrian Army. And the Free Syrian Army, not just the Americans, the Europeans in general, right? And the West. And the Free Syrian Army, well, and again, you're talking Saddam Hussein, you're talking Assad. These are people who killed thousands of their own people.
Yeah.
And would go on to kill many more thousands of their own people, right? But again, this idea that we were in the Facebook world, we were in a Google world, information was flowing everywhere. The old regimes couldn't keep the young people in their place. And again, one of the phenomenon of the demography of the Arab world is this huge youth population, right?
Yeah.
And there was a sense that these would all fall in a domino and they would be replaced by open, democratic, freely elected governments.
Yeah.
Nothing like that
And
has
we
happened.
could sell them lots of Coca-Cola.
Sell lots
and
of Coca-Cola,
denim jeans
and
cars and iPhones, the
all
whole
that
lot.
sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But none of that came to pass. So I'm going to we start in 9/11, and 9/11 is maybe 2.5 decades ago, so like a quarter of a century, right?
Yeah.
And it's the Americans doing Israel's bidding in the region, or at least aligned with Israel. I've always said the Israeli tail tends to wag the American dog through lots and lots of lobbying of Israel in America, right?
Yeah.
Now, does Israel want chaos around it? Yes, it does. Does it want this type of chaos? I'm not that sure. Because the last thing the Israelis want is a caliphate on their northern border.
Yeah.
You know, Assad may well have been a barbaric tyrant, but he constituted a little bit of stability. And I think that's what the Israelis would have wanted, right? But now they've got something different.
The devil you know.
Exactly. So you start in 9/11 in New York. There's a city called Gaziantep that I visited about 6 years ago. I did a charity event in Istanbul for refugees, for child refugees in these refugee camps in Gaziantep.
Yeah.
Gaziantep is just over the border from Aleppo, just over the border.
Yeah.
So that was full
Well, you talked to him about economics.
No, I did a gig.
You can imagine all the kids here. What the hell's your man on about?
Well, Lucy came with me. We went, we talked about football. That's what you talk about. All kids about football. No, we did a gig. I did a gig in Istanbul, which raised money for these children. And I went down to Gaziantep to see the refugee camps. And you could see very, very clearly that this was the breeding ground of the next generation.
Yeah.
Because these refugee camps are enormous. They're entirely soulless. And they're barbed wired off. Right?
Yeah,
so
it's like a prison, yeah.
It's like a prison.
Yeah.
It's like a prison for children. And everybody's there, the parents, the mums and dads and whatever. Although the Turks did let in a huge amount of Syrians to work. Because I'd forgotten that Syrians they don't even speak the same language. They don't read the same alphabet.
Yeah.
So it must have been so difficult for those people to move in. And of course, Turkey's a big player in this, right? So Gaziantep was the launch pad for the HTS. And I'll tell you what's different. So Gaziantep is a city that is 11,000 years old.
Wow.
11,000. It has 3 million people, and I had never heard of it until I flew to this place.
Yeah.
It is very Islamic. It's the polar opposite to Istanbul. So Istanbul is Western, and it's fun, and it's cocktails, and it's beer.
It's one of my favorite cities.
Yeah. Everyone loves it, right?
Yeah.
Gaziantep is right in the middle of Anatolia, right? It's on the Anatolian plain. Now, the Anatolians are, fascinatingly, the people with the most varied DNA in the world.
You're right.
Yeah, because everyone came through there. It's the center of civilization.
Yeah. It's at the end of the Silk Road.
It's bang in the middle of the Silk Road. So everything came through there. Everything and every massive civilization, right? The Persians, the Romans, the Ottomans, all these geezers came through there, right? But now it seems like a very austere, a very religious city, particularly in contrast to Istanbul. But this is the place from which the HTS have launched their campaign. And this is the place the Turks were financing the HTS.
Right. Okay.
So you see what happens, right?
So this is Erdogan's kind of meddling.
This is very much Erdogan. We talked about it last week, that the Turks are not to be underestimated. They have a massive army. They have a massive history. But they're not particularly liked in Syria, because Syria was occupied by the Ottomans for hundreds of years. So the visceral reaction of Syrians to Turks is, you are Ottomans. You're coming to get us again. And of course, you have the internal problem the Turks have, which is the Kurds.
Yeah.
And the Kurds are the most unlucky nation in the world.
Yeah, they are.
They're the only nation not to have got their own gig after the Sykes-Picot. And why didn't they get their own gig? Because oil is in Kurdistan.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
So the Brits and the French decided to carve up these areas, create Iraq, create Syria as these new lines in the sands in order to prevent an integrated, unified state called Kurdistan owning the oil that is now the oil of Iraq, and the oil of Syria, and part of the oil of Iran. Because of the tyranny of geography, one would have thought that the Kurds would have been best positioned about 100 years ago to do well. They are the itinerant race. They are the gypsy race. They have nowhere to go because they lived on top of oil. Right? And again, this is the sort of logic. But let's go back to the Arab Spring, John. So you're talking about 2012, 2013. Assad turns on his people with an unbelievable ferocity, and it precipitates a civil war. Now, I always thought that the Americans were looking at this almost like a game, and this really became evident to me. Another gig I was doing many years ago in a place called Scottsdale, Arizona. I mentioned at the top,
Yes,
right?
yeah. Go on.
So this is a Google gig called Zeitgeist. And it's really interesting. Lots of fascinating people coming to speak, etc. But during the middle of it, sort of a Zoom, this is kind of pre-Zoom, but kind of a screen goes up and all the technology is going, oh, wow, technology, amazing, you know? And it's in what looks like an apartment block that is under siege in Aleppo.
Okay.
And they're talking to the Free Syrian Army.
Sorry, can I just ask you, is this the Google guys
This is the Google guys
talking to...
soldiers, armed guys, right? As if they were like kind of tech bros.
Right, okay.
And I'm sitting there aware, maybe Europeans are more just aware of the amount of people being slaughtered. And they're almost kind of high-fiving. These guys, it's a future democracy, you know? And I was thinking, okay, so into the vacuum comes the civil war. And against Assad, you have a disparate bunch. You've got Kurds, you've got jihadis, you've got the Free Syrian Army, which are backed by the Americans and the Brits. You've got all sorts of characters, right?
Sorry, I'm still back there. What was the purpose of that?
The purpose of this was to show, right, so one of the quotes of the Arab Spring was some very clever journalist or commentator in Egypt said, we mobilized on Facebook, we got our message out on YouTube, and we came together on WhatsApp. The Americans loved that.
And so this is a celebration?
This is a celebration of democracy and technology in together. And I'm sitting at the back thinking, because I'd lived in the bloody region, I'd worked there, I was thinking, you've no idea what you've unleashed. You've no idea.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So, of course, what does Assad do when his back's against the wall in 2014 or 15, 2014, 2015? He goes back to the well of Russia, the very place where I saw those fellas at the In Tourist, because the links between Russia and Syria go back a long way. And Russia, under Putin, before Ukraine, wanted to be seen as being back in the game.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So they come in on Assad's side. And of course, the Russians come in with planes and bombs and horrendous ordnance, right?
Yeah.
The Iranians
That's their
come in.
style, isn't it? They come in and they level everything.
They level everything. They level everything. Although increasingly that's the Israeli style as well, right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
You know, we've seen. But that
modern warfare.
Modern warfare, yeah. Well, I mean, and the Russians learned that in Grozny.
Yes.
Because they destroyed Grozny when they fought the Chechens. And now the Chechens are in their pocket. It's fascinating the way the world turns, right? But the Iranians then wanted, in effect, a land bridge, a Shia land bridge from Iran through Iraq, where there are many Shias, into Syria, but mainly to their proxies in Hezbollah in South Lebanon. So they wanted this Shia arc. So they were very happy to come in and help Assad, as long as he facilitated the Shia in Hezbollah.
Yeah.
So they put their military guys on the ground. So there's lots and lots of Iranian military tacticians, strategists on the ground in Syria. And then Assad gets Hezbollah to do the fighting for him. So the actual meat grinder of the civil war is being driven by Shia from South Lebanon in Hezbollah. The military hardware comes from the Russians and strategy comes from the Iranians. And little by little by little, Assad turns the civil war on his side. But only after 14 million people have left that country.
Yeah.
Refugees.
14 million.
1-4.
Yeah.
And it's estimated that 500,000 have been killed by Assad. Right? 500,000 of his own people.
Well, I saw they turned up all these torture chambers and underground cells and stuff where they were just slaughtering people.
Yeah.
Just the cruelty of it is just, it's just beyond me.
It's a mind-boggling regime.
Yeah.
And you see the enthusiasm of the average Syrian on your screens now.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they're going to celebrate today. I'm sure they're very, very, very nervous and anxious about what's coming down the track. But just think about it as the geostrategic area. You have Iran, Assad, Russia, and the Shia all together, all ruling the roost down there, right? Now, we forget that Syria invaded Lebanon and occupied Lebanon for about 20 years.
Mm.
So it's always been this unbelievably important player in the area.
And of course, there's the Russian base there as well.
There's a Russian base, and the Russian base is in the Alawite area. And Assad is an Alawite. And the Alawites are an offshoot of the Shia, but they're not quite Shia, right? And the majority people in Syria are Sunni.
Mm.
And Assad, like Saddam Hussein, always kept down the Sunni because they always wanted to divide and conquer.
Mm.
So Christians lived in Syria, quite unmolested. Alawites lived in Syria. Shia lived in Syria, all held together by a coalition which was driven by notional socialism, Ba'ath socialism, notional. That's all gone. That's all gone. Then, of course, what you get is Gaza. So there's an uneasy truce. Syrian civil war is over. Assad is in power in Damascus. Increasingly, some of the Arab countries are recognizing him.
Mm.
The United Arab Emirates, for example, only last week came out in support of him. They're going to have to do a big volte-face, okay?
Yeah.
The Saudis, again, tacitly supported him. They're going to have to do a volte-face, okay? But there's a truce for about 6 years. Life in Syria is becoming bearable. The civil war is over, right? But what emerged in the civil war, the most important thing, is ISIS, John.
Yeah.
So this changed the Al-Qaeda-ISIS axis, you know? I mean, ISIS were the fellas who made Al-Qaeda look like pussies.
Yeah.
And Jihadi John and all that, beheading people and that horrendous stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's when the Americans were quite glad to allow the Russians a free hand in Syria to fight against ISIS. So it stopped ISIS in their tracks.
Mm.
But now they are back in this new guy, who is a former Al-Qaeda member. Okay.
But at the same time, he is trying to denounce his Al-Qaeda roots.
It's like Jerry Adams was there from the IRA.
Yeah, it is a bit like that, yeah.
It is.
He's changing his name and everything.
I'm not that guy. I'm another fella. Right? But let's see what happened. All these truces in the Middle East are unbelievably fragile because they're predicated on outside players.
Mm.
So the Russians invade Ukraine and get bogged down in Ukraine and have no longer the money, the arms, or the soldiers to help Assad. First thing. So already his world is weakening. The Israelis have had stunning successes against Iranian-backed groups, Hamas and Hezbollah.
Yeah.
So once it takes out Hamas and once it takes out Hezbollah, Syria and Assad, they don't have any infantry anymore. They don't have the foot soldiers that they needed, right?
Yeah.
So the Israelis, by attacking Hezbollah, created the situation where this new group, the HTS, saw their opportunity. Hezbollah's gone. The Syrian military changed sides, which was quite phenomenal.
Yeah.
Because they didn't do that during the civil war.
Yeah.
But they did run scared last week. The Iranians have been really defanged by the Israelis. Hezbollah are gone. All he has is his army. The Russians don't have any troops anymore. They don't have any money anymore. And they certainly don't have any munitions that they can spare because they're already getting North Koreans.
Well, I was going to say, are we going to see the North Koreans in Syria?
The poor North Koreans. I just think, like, isn't that so awful? It's a deal. It's a soldiers for bread deal that North Korea signed. You know?
Yeah.
But you come back to the significance of what is going on now, right? Obviously, the number one significance is lots of people are being released from prison. There's going to be regime change, all that sort of thing.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, Mac.
Okay.
Let's take a quick break and we'll come back and talk about where do we go from here after this. So, Mac, it's regime change in Syria and all throughout the region. It's completely up in the air. Who knows where we're going? But where do we go from here?
Let's go back to the 9/11 idea. This is the culmination of 25 years of, in effect, Western policy.
Yeah.
Which has been to get rid of what they would call the tyrants in the dictators, the single-party dictators, whether it was Gaddafi, Saddam, or Assad, right? So that's all happened. The big losers, obviously, in this are Russia and Iran, because they have been dramatically humiliated by this, right?
Yeah.
Putin loves the idea that being the kingmaker in the Middle East. And ironically, the Americans, despite having really kicked this off, under Obama, disappeared from the Middle East,
Yeah.
right? They just pulled out, right? The Americans said, we've had enough of this, right?
Yeah.
So in fact, Obama has been as isolationist in the Middle East as Trump might end up being.
Yeah.
But obviously Russia is the major loser because its guy, Assad, is now in Russia seeking asylum, maybe in the in-tourist hotel. Maybe in the very in-tourist hotel.
He's propped up at the bar as we
He's
speak.
propped up at the bar and speaks saying, how did I get here? Who am I? Okay, number one, right? Of course, Iran is a major loser because Iran loses its puppet in the region, who was Assad, because Iran wanted a Shia protectorate. And if it couldn't have a Shia protectorate, it had an Alawite protectorate, but as long as it wasn't Sunni.
Yeah, yeah.
The new leader whose name changes. So what his name was Gilani, wasn't it, John?
I tell you what his name was, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani.
Okay.
And he's now changed it back to his real name.
Which is?
Which is Ahmed al-Shara.
So this is a bit like Desi. Remember Desi O'Hare, the border fox?
Yes.
Right? This is the Arab equivalent, right? Now, if that reference goes over your head, just Google it. Google it. Irish history, a particularly unpleasant part of Irish history about 30 or maybe even 40 years ago. Anyway, we come back, right? Iran is clearly damaged. Russia is damaged. Hezbollah is no more as a fighting force, or at least has been damaged sufficiently that it couldn't muster enough strength to save Syria, right? And Assad. Now, interestingly, remember I was in Baalbek a couple of years ago in Lebanon.
Yeah.
On the road to Baalbek and towards Syria, there were massive big posters of Putin everywhere.
Right, okay.
Massive big posters of Putin, right? So it was very explicit that Putin was the Syrian guy, the Hezbollah guy. So that now has changed completely. The Israelis have already gone in for a land grab in southern Syria, northern Israel. They occupied the Golan Heights in 73.
Yeah.
They never gave them back, right?
Yeah.
They're now occupying what there was a buffer zone between Syria and Israel. The Israelis are occupying that now. They are bombing. So they will have grabs territory.
Yeah.
The Kurds, who the Turks don't like, are in the northwest of the country, and they have a big, significant place. They have a significant part. And of course, our friend Gilani comes from the Al-Qaeda DNA, which is the ISIS DNA.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is the big fear. And even the Turks in their latest statement, despite having kicked this whole thing off, they're now saying, the Turkish foreign minister is now saying, well, you've got to behave and you've got to protect minorities and you've got to do all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But there isn't a tradition of protecting minorities in that ISIS DNA.
Well, in his new guise, al-Jilani is saying that he is renouncing, as I was saying earlier, renouncing his Al-Qaeda roots and is promising to be more tolerant and inclusive and, dare I say, woke?
Woke, I would not say, is a sort of...
No.
Imagine they start talking about gender-neutral toilets.
Yes.
Right? That's what we're going to discuss first, right? But just think of it. Just look at the country. Look at the map. Look where it is, right? It is right at the center of everything.
Yeah.
Right? It has significant oil reserves. So whoever takes Syria can finance themselves. It now has a reformed jihadist in charge. He may well last a week. He may well last a month. He may well last a decade. Who knows, right? Russia has disappeared and doesn't have the wherewithal to come back in. Iran has been given more than a bloody nose. And that might precipitate the Iranians to accelerate their quest for nuclear power and a nuclear bomb.
Oh, God.
Because they've no proxies. The Iranians set up this very elaborate ring around Israel, of Hezbollah, of Hamas, etc., basically to hem in the Israelis. That's now over. That's gone.
Do you think this might precipitate an even more kind of head-on clash between Sunni and Shiite?
Well, that all depends on three things. One is what the Saudis do. So the Saudis, we know, financed ISIS. The Saudis denied they financed Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda was on a collision course with America. But we know even the personal family of bin Laden was profoundly enriched by the Saudi regime.
Yeah.
It depends on what happens in Iraq It depends on, again, what the Israelis do. Because the Israelis have an interest in fermenting chaos in the Arab world. But it's a very fine game they play because it's chaos, but not complete chaos, right? So they will... Controllable chaos. So they are the top dogs, right? And they have their enemies fighting each other. But that idea of my enemy's enemy is exactly what led to ISIS. It's exactly what led to the warlords in Libya. It's exactly what led to the bloodshed and the civil war in Iraq after Saddam Hussein's departure. So it's inconceivable that Syria will become a stable country because there's too many ethnic minorities, there's too many religious, there's too much blood being spilt. You know, too many scores have got to be settled.
Yeah.
You know, you can imagine the score settling that's going to go on in Syria against the Assad regime, against the Assad police force, against the Assad army, against those prison guards who put those people in prison, right?
Yeah.
Lebanon has no control, can't offer anything because the Lebanese are too weak. The Jordanians are entirely in the pockets of the Americans simply because that's the relationship that they need. The Saudis are fighting the Houthis, so they're kind of bogged down as well. They've lost their power. And all the while, the Americans are going to do something the Americans have never done before, which they're going to stay out of it.
Yeah.
Now, in the same way as Iran uses Hezbollah as its proxy, America uses Israel as its proxy. It's a much more sophisticated, refined game.
Yeah.
But it's the same end game.
But what it will end up for Europe is a lot more people on the move.
That's where I want to end this podcast, John. The other piece of news this week was the collapse of the French government.
Yes.
Now, why did the French government collapse? Because Marine Le Pen collapsed it.
Yeah.
Now, Marine Le Pen is the product of a backlash against migrants, particularly Islamic migrants.
Yeah.
Who's going to come out of Syria? Arab Islamic migrants. And they are going to come through Turkey, through Greece, all the way up, as you saw in Germany.
Yeah.
Who's on the rise in Germany? The AfD. What is their calling card? Anti-Islamic migrants. And going back to a Germany that looks and feels more like the 1970s than it does now. Over in the UK, Reform is an anti-immigrant party. And people forget that the big story of the British election was Reform.
Yeah.
I mean, the Labour Party got in by default, right? But the Reform ate the lunch of the Tories, not Labour.
And Elon Musk has just offered them 100 million.
Reform?
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
To campaign next, right?
Yeah.
So what we're seeing, the French government, the German government, the British establishment, all reacting to migration. I can't see a future, particularly in the next year, that doesn't involve more migration of desperate, terrified people.
Yeah.
Because the history of these regime change moments is that it takes years for stability, no matter what that stability is, to bed itself in. And you're in for chaos. Everyone who was involved in the Syrian regime will leave because they're going to be killed if they don't. So I think what we're going to see 2025 is again a mass movement of desperate people on Europe's southwestern front. You know, first coming to Greece, but then coming everywhere else. And right now is just the moment we don't need this because our politics is already moving very dramatically to the right.
Yeah.
Apart from our oasis of centrist dads here in Ireland, where the Irish people were asked to vote for change and they said, I'm grand. I get the fella who was in there last, the fella at the bar. Yeah, we change him, we put him on one stool and we put the other fella on the other stool and then we're grand, right? In our oasis of centrism here. But to come back to the very serious point, we are highly likely to see a demographic surge of young migrants out of Syria. And those people are going to have the effect in Europe of making an already fragile political status quo even more fragile. That, I think, is the takeaway.